This morning, we are joined by Dr. Ahmad Jabbar, an interventional cardiologist with Cardiovascular Institute of the South. He is going to teach us about peripheral artery disease, or PAD, and the impact of high cholesterol on patients who are diagnosed with the disease. Welcome back, doctor.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks so much for joining me this morning. Let's start with peripheral artery disease, or PAD. What is it, for those who do not know?
Simply put, peripheral artery disease is the narrowing or the buildup of blockage of the arteries outside of the heart, which can happen anywhere in the body. You can see it in the belly, in the stomach, in the arms, but most commonly when we're referring to peripheral artery disease, it's usually in the legs. And it's essentially related to plaque buildup within the arteries of the vessels that leads to narrowing over time.
What are some of the symptoms of PAD?
So some of the symptoms you can see is painful cramps, specifically in the calf area of the legs, but it can be anywhere along the legs depending on where the blockage is located in the arteries. You can have numbness or weakness. Something as simple as just a difference in the hair growth of the legs sometimes can signify someone's at risk for peripheral artery disease. Cold feet is another sign or symptom that you can identify. And then usually someone who has a weak pulse. So you can actually palpate your pulse in your feet, or even in the back of your knee, back of your legs behind your knee. If you notice that it's not pulsating as strong, and usually it's very hard to determine that, but a physician can identify that. That may signify blood flow is decreased in those arteries.
And you know, there are so many different risk factors when it comes to peripheral artery disease, but one you want to focus on this morning has to do with cholesterol. How does cholesterol impact your risk of getting PAD?
So first off, cholesterol is found in all of our cells. It's one of the building blocks responsible for things like hormones and vitamins. So every time we talk about cholesterol, we think about the bad things, but cholesterol is there in our body for a reason. So that's the important thing to kind of identify. But cholesterol, what it does is it basically circulates in the blood, and it can essentially adhere to the walls of the blood vessels and create plaque. And and that's more specifically talking about high levels of bad cholesterol, or LDL. And that over time builds up in the arteries throughout the body, and it can restrict blood flow. And that's why cholesterol, when it's too high over time, over years, can lead to restriction in the blood flow of the arteries, of just not only in the periphery, in the legs, but everywhere else in the body.
And you know, for people watching this right now who may be saying, oh my goodness, I actually fall into those symptoms, what do you suggest they do next? Come over to see a doctor. What do you all do to help diagnose this condition?
So we could do something as simple as checking the pressures in your legs and comparing that to the pressures in your arm, and that's called an ABI exam, which allows us to identify if there's a difference between the blood flow in the arteries in various parts of the body, and looking for if you are at risk for any blockages. And if there is a concern, then we can do a simple ultrasound looking at the arteries to identify if you have any blockages in those arteries. And if you do have any blockages on the ultrasound, we can do further testing to really identify that even further with things like CAT scans, MRIs, or even something like an angiogram.
And once you identify it, it's diagnosed, how do you all treat it?
So depending on the severity of your symptoms, some people, if they have blockages severe enough to where it can lead to something like an ulcer or damage to tissue in the legs, we can basically do an angiogram and identify those blockages and try to open up those blockages with minimally invasive procedures. But before we even get to that point, we want to treat the risk factors, right? We know, as I mentioned, cholesterol buildup can lead to plaque buildup in the arteries of the walls. So we want to try to reduce cholesterol and try to minimize those risk factors, especially smoking, right? We know that smoking is a big problem for people with coronary disease and peripheral artery disease. And so something as simple as reducing smoking or completely quitting smoking and reducing your cholesterol can easily reduce your symptoms and minimize any complications in the future from peripheral artery disease.
And you know, doctor, I've been wanting to ask you this question since we started talking about peripheral artery disease a while back. Varicose veins, does that give any type of indication that we may be going down the wrong path, meaning we might develop PAD, or that has no connection at all?
So varicose veins are usually related to problems in your veins in your venous system. And so just like the arteries are the conduits that send blood to the tissue, the veins are the conduits or the vessels that allow blood to go from the tissue back to the heart. So two different problems we're dealing with here. Usually people who have peripheral artery disease don't necessarily they're not necessarily at risk for varicose veins, or vice versa. They don't necessarily come hand in hand, but some people may have both.
Very interesting. Great conversation as always this morning, doctor. Thank you for joining us this morning. Hey, if you have more questions about PAD or your heart health in general, log on to cardio.com. You can also contact the Cardiovascular Institute of the South by giving them a call at 504-354-5252. They're located at 1901 Manhattan Boulevard, Building A, Suite 200 in Harvey. Stick with us. We'll be right back.